Her late father left her a dry well. Harlon Pike, who had survived 9 Black Hills winters and buried 2 men to the cold, told her plainly, "That hole will not feed your boy. By January, he will starve in your arms." She had $47, 1 child, and no team to haul 4 months of food. On January 8th, 1881, the cold hit 17 below, and the road vanished under drift. But 4 months earlier, Eli Vangen had never run a cellar in her life. She had arrived in the Black Hills in the spring of 1879, following a husband who chased gold and found only wage work at a Whitewood Creek mill. The acre above Pine Coulee had seemed like a future then. Now, walking back from the cemetery where they had just buried her father, Eli Vangen understood it for what it was: a rock shelf, a leaning shack. You're in a hole in the ground that had never given anyone anything worth keeping. Niels held her hand. 6 years old. His grip tightened every time the wind gusted, and she knew he was waiting for her to say something that would make the world make sense again. She had nothing. Her father was dead. Her husband had been dead for 11 months. The acre was hers now, which meant the debts were hers, the empty larder was hers, and the winter coming down from the northern ridges was hers to face alone. The shack stood where Aslak had built it, canted slightly toward the grade as if it had given up on standing straight. 1 room, a cast iron stove that burned through wood faster than she could split it, a rope bed, a table with 1 leg shimmed by a Bible her father had never opened. Through the single window, she could see the collar of the shaft he had spent 10 years digging, the head frame weathered gray, the windlass rope frayed where it met the drum. The dry well. That was what everyone in Pine Coulee called it. Aslak Vangen's dry well. The joke that proved even Norwegians could be fools. Eli pushed open the door and stood in the doorway, while Niels slipped past her to sit on the bed. The afternoon light fell across the floor in a slant that would be gone in an hour. She counted what she could see. Half a cord of split pine stacked against the north wall, a burlap sack of flour, maybe 8 pounds left, a crock of lard, dried beans in a jar, salt, coffee ground she had already used twice, a tin of matches, 2 blankets that smelled like her father, even though she had washed them after he stopped breathing. But she crossed to the table and opened the tobacco tin where Aslak had kept the household money. $47. She counted it twice to be sure. Then she sat down and stared at the coins and the few paper notes until her eyes burned. $47. 1 child. No team. No husband. Winter coming. The numbers came to her that night in fragments, each one sharper than the last. A household of 2 needed flour, beans, salt pork, coffee, lamp oil, and enough wood to keep the stove fed from first frost to thaw. That was the minimum. That was what would keep them alive if nothing went wrong, if neither of them got sick, if the winter came late and left early, if the prices at the company store did not climb as the road worsened. She did not know the exact figures, but she knew enough. She had watched her father haul and buy and calculate for a decade. She had watched her husband come home from the mill with wages that vanished into Milo Haskins's ledger within a week. She understood the shape of the problem, even if she could not yet draw its edges. In the morning, she left Niels with Bridget Coyle at the boarding house and walked down to the freight station where the wagons from Pierre unloaded. Harlon Pike was there, checking manifests against crates, his breath steaming in the early chill. She waited until he finished with a driver, then stepped forward. Harlon was 48 years old. He had hauled freight between Pierre and the Black Hills for 9 winters. He had buried 2 men who had frozen on the road, one of them a teamster who had worked for him for 3 years. I'm sure his hands were scarred from frostbite and rope burn. When he looked at Eli, she saw something she had not expected. Not contempt, not dismissal, something worse. Recognition. He knew what she was facing. He had seen it before. She asked him what it would cost to haul 4 months of provisions up to the acre on the coulee shelf. She asked about flour and beans and salt pork. She asked about wood. Harlon did not answer right away. He took off his hat and ran his hand through his thinning hair, and then he put the hat back on and looked at her the way a doctor looks at a patient who has asked the wrong question. "You are Aslak's daughter," he said. "I am." "And your husband passed at the White Wood Mill." "Last October." Harlon nodded slowly. He looked past her toward the grade that climbed up to Pine Coulee, then back at her face. "How much money do you have?" She hesitated. She did not want to say it out loud, but there was no point in lying. Harlon Pike was not offering charity. He was measuring a problem. $47. Harlon exhaled. It was not a sigh. It was the sound of a man setting down a weight he had not wanted to pick up. $47, he repeated. And a boy. Niels, 6 years old. $47, a 6-year-old, and no team. Eli did not answer. There was nothing to answer. Harlon pulled a stub of pencil from his vest pocket and a scrap of paper from the crate beside him. He did not look at her while he wrote. He wrote slowly, the way a man writes when he's doing arithmetic he does not want to do. "Flour," he said, 200 pounds minimum. You will stretch it, but you need 200 to be safe. At current prices, that is $11. Beans, 100 pounds, $4. Salt pork, 50 pounds, $6. Lard, coffee, salt, lamp oil, small goods. Call it $8. That is $29 for food, and I'm being generous. I'm assuming you eat thin. I am assuming the boy does not grow. Eli listened, her fingernails pressed into her palms. "Now," Harlon continued, "hauling. A wagon up Raven grade when the road is still good costs $2 per 100 pounds plus a handling fee. By November, when the road is uncertain, it costs $3. By December, if the road is still open at all, it costs $4, and you pay extra for the risk. You're looking at another $15 to $20 just to get the food up to your acre, maybe more if the weather turns early." He stopped writing. He looked at her. That is $45 to $50, and I have not mentioned wood. I have half a cord. Half a cord. Harlon shook his head. Half a cord is 2 weeks. Maybe 3 if you burn cold and wear every blanket you own. You need 5 cords minimum. 6 is safer. 7 is what I would want if I were you. How much for the wood? You cannot buy wood. Not at the prices they charge in town. You cut it yourself, or you hire someone to cut it for you, and the men who cut wood for hire are already booked through October. You could offer to pay, but you would need $30 just for the labor, and that assumes you can find someone willing to climb up to that shelf and work for a widow they do not know. Eli stood very still. The numbers added themselves in her head. $47, food and hauling, $50, or wood labor, $30. The gap was not a crack. It was a canyon. "I could sell the acre," she said. Harlon looked at her for a long moment. "You could. But who would buy it? The well is dry. The ground is rock. The shack is falling down. Milo Haskins might offer you $20 and call it a favor. Maybe 30. You would still be short, and you would have nowhere to go." Eli felt the cold air on her face. It was still September. The cold would get worse. Every day it would get worse until the worst day came, and then it would keep getting worse after that. "What would you do?" she asked. "If you were me?" Harlon Pike put the pencil back in his pocket. He folded the paper and held it out to her, and she took it without looking at what he had written. "If I were you," he said, and his voice was not unkind, I would take the boy and go east before the first snow. Find relatives, find a church, find anyone who will take you in. Because what you are describing is not a plan, it is a prayer, and the winter does not answer prayers. He paused. His eyes moved to the head frame visible on the coolie shelf above the grade. That hole your father dug, he said. It will not feed your boy. By January, he will starve in your arms. She did not go east. She went back to the boarding house and collected Niels and paid Bridget 2 cents for the watching and walked back up to the acre. She built a fire in the stove and cooked beans and gave Niels his portion and ate her own while standing by the window, looking out at the head frame in the fading light. That hole will not feed your boy. By January, he will starve in your arms. Harlon Pike was not a cruel man. That was what made his words stick like splinters under her skin. He was not trying to hurt her. He was trying to save her the pain of hoping. He had seen this before. He knew how it ended. But Eli could not leave. She could not explain it in a way that would satisfy Harlon or Bridget or anyone else. It was not stubbornness, though people would call it that. It was not foolishness, though they would call it that too. It was something simpler and harder. She had nowhere else to go. Her mother had died when Eli was 12. Her father had brought her to the Black Hills because there was nothing left in Minnesota except a burned-out farm and debts her uncle had refused to cover. Her husband had come from Ohio, from a family that had written him off when he headed west. There were no relatives waiting in the east. There was no church that knew her name. There was only the acre, the shack, the head frame, and the child who trusted her to keep him alive. That night, after Niels fell asleep, she sat at the table with her father's tobacco tin and counted the $47 one more time. Then she opened the other tin, the one Aslak had kept his papers in, and spread the contents across the table. Receipts. A deed. A letter from her mother dated 1862, the year before Eli was born. Notes in her father's cramped handwriting about the shaft, depths, soil types, timber needs, the date he hit rock and the date he gave up on water. At the bottom of the pile was a single sheet of paper, folded twice and sealed with candle wax. She cracked the seal and unfolded it. The well is not dry. It is finished. Do not tell anyone what is at the bottom. She read the words 3 times. She did not understand them. Her father had never said anything about the well being finished. He had complained about it, cursed it, apologized to anyone who would listen for wasting 10 years on a fool's errand. Dry. That was the word he used, always dry. But he had written something else before he died. He had hidden it in the tin with his papers, sealed it with wax, and never told her what it meant. Eli stared at the head frame through the window. The moon was rising behind the ridgeline, and the gray wood of the frame caught just enough light to stand out against the dark. The well is not dry. She knew she should sleep. She knew she should wait until morning, until light, until she could think clearly. But the words on the paper burned in her mind, and she understood with sudden, terrible clarity that she had been looking at the problem wrong. She had been thinking about what the acre lacked: the shack, the thin soil, the failed well, the missing husband, the absent team. She had not been thinking about what her father might have left behind. Dawn came cold and clear. Eli fed Niels porridge made thin with water and told him to stay inside near the stove until she came back. He nodded, his small face serious, and she kissed his forehead and went out to the head frame. The windlass was old but functional. Her father had built it himself: oak drum and iron crank handle and a rope that needed replacing but would hold her weight if she was careful. She leaned over the shaft collar and looked down. Darkness. The ladder rungs her father had cut into the wall were visible for the first 10 feet, then shadow swallowed everything. She tied a lantern to a length of cord and lowered it first. The flame flickered but held. 20 feet down, 25, 30. The bottom appeared in the yellow circle of light. Packed earth, dry as bone, no water standing, no mud. Eli tested the first ladder rung with her foot. It held. She tied a rope around her waist, looped it over the windlass drum, and began to descend. The shaft walls were crib timber for the first 12 feet, then raw rock. Her father had hit bedrock and kept going, chipping through stone with hand drills and patience, and whatever anger drove a man to spend a decade on a single hole. The air grew cooler as she descended. Not cold, cool, stable. A faint smell of earth and something else, something that reminded her of the root cellars she had seen in Minnesota. At the bottom, her boots touched packed soil. She unhooked the lantern and held it out, letting the light spread. The shaft ended in a wall of stone, but cut into the stone at hip height was an oak door. Eli stood very still. Her heart was beating hard enough that she could feel it in her throat. The well is not dry. It is finished. She understood. Her father had not been digging for water. He had been digging down past the frost line into dry bedrock where the temperature stayed constant year-round. He had borrowed minecraft, cribbing, and rockwork, and the patient calculation of depths and angles, and he had built something that no one above ground could see or suspect. The door had iron hinges and a simple latch. She lifted the latch and pulled. The door swung outward, and cool air flowed past her face, and the lantern light fell into a room. The chamber was roughly 12 by 18 feet, with a ceiling high enough that Eli did not have to stoop. The walls were dressed stone where they met the bedrock, timber where the ceiling braces ran, and the floor was compacted earth covered with a layer of sand. The air was cool and dry and still, but it was not the structure that stopped her breath. It was what the chamber contained. Wooden bins lined the walls, slatted for air circulation, each one labeled in her father's hand. Potatoes, turnips, carrots, beets. The potatoes sat in the bins closest to the door, separated from the others by a low partition. The root vegetables lay in sand, packed in layers. The sand slightly damp to the touch. Higher on the wall, netted shelves held onions, hung dry and separate from the moisture below. In the far corner, grain barrels stood on wooden runners, elevated from the floor. She counted 4: wheat, oats, rye, beans. Near the inner wall, farthest from the door, 2 smoked hams and several sides of salt pork hung from iron hooks driven into the timber. On a slate board mounted beside the door, her father had chalked marks in neat columns, dates, counts, notes about vent positions. A small diagram showed the shaft above, with 2 lines marked vent and arrows indicating airflow. Eli lowered the lantern and stood in the center of the chamber. Her hands were shaking. Aslak Vangen had not spent 10 years digging a dry well. He had spent 10 years building a vault. So the logic assembled itself in her mind, piece by piece, like tumblers falling into place. Below the frost line, the temperature held steady, 35 degrees, maybe 38, cold enough to keep vegetables from rotting, warm enough to keep them from freezing. The ventilation shafts she had seen in the slate diagram pulled air down in one direction and released it in another, creating circulation that prevented mold and kept moisture balanced. The sand around the roots held just enough dampness to prevent shriveling, but not enough to breed decay. The onions hung high and dry because onions rotted in humidity. The grain barrels stood off the floor because damp rose from earth, even when the earth was dry. Every detail she had mocked or ignored, every scrap of knowledge her father had muttered about while she was not listening, nor every strange insistence on how things should be stored and where they should go, all of it made sense now. The dry well was not a failure. It was a disguise. She crossed to the nearest bin and pulled out a potato. It was firm, clean, unblemished. She carried it to the grain barrel and opened the lid. The wheat inside was dry and whole, no sign of weevil or mold. She lifted an onion from the netted shelf and squeezed it gently. Solid, no soft spots. Everything in this chamber had been stored properly. Everything had been kept alive. She did not know how much food was here. She would have to count. But standing in the cool silence of her father's secret, she understood for the first time that the math might be different than she had thought. The counting took most of the day. She made Niels come down with her on the second trip, with a rope around his waist, her hands guiding his feet to the ladder rungs. He was frightened at first, but when he saw the room, when she lit the second lantern and let him walk between the bins and touch the grain barrels and look up at the hanging meat, his fear turned to wonder. "Grandfather built this?" he asked. "Yes." "Why did he not tell anyone?" Eli looked at the oak door, at the hinges set clean into the stone, at the chalk marks her father had left behind. "I think he did not trust anyone else to keep it safe." She sent Niels back up to tend the fire and began her count. Potatoes, 60 bushels, maybe 65. Turnips, 12 bushels. Carrots, 9 bushels in sand. Beets, 6 bushels. Onions, 40 pounds. Grain, 4 barrels, each holding between 80 and 100 pounds. Salt pork, perhaps 60 pounds. Smoked ham, 2 sides, 20 pounds each. She did the arithmetic 3 times. She wrote the numbers on the slate board beneath her father's marks and stared at them until her eyes watered. This was not a larder for one household. This was a reserve. This was a vault built to carry people through a siege. But she did not know if it would last. She did not know if the potatoes would stay firm, or if the grain would spoil, or if the onions would soften and rot before spring. She had watched her father store food, but she had never run a cellar herself. The knowledge she had was fragments, half-remembered rules, warnings without explanations. She needed to learn, fast, and she needed to decide what to do with what she had found. Bridget Coyle came to check on her 3 days after Aslak's burial. She brought a loaf of bread and a jar of preserved peaches, and she stood in the doorway of the shack with her arms crossed, looking at Eli the way a woman looks at another woman she expects to fail. Bridget was 38 years old. She had run the boarding house since her husband died in the homestake collapse of '76. She knew how to stretch $1, how to keep a kitchen fed on scraps and stubbornness, how to manage a cellar that sweated under the floorboards and lost half its stores to moisture every year. She was not unkind, but she did not believe in miracles, and she looked at Eli's situation and saw no path that did not end in disaster. "I heard you went to see Harlon Pike," Bridget said. "I did." "And what did he tell you?" "The truth." Bridget nodded. "Then you know. You cannot make it through winter on $47, not without a team, not without help, not without more than half a cord of wood." Eli did not argue. She poured Bridget a cup of weak coffee and set it on the table. "There is another way," Eli said. Bridget raised an eyebrow. She did not pick up the cup. "What way?" Eli hesitated. She had told no one about the chamber. She had counted and recounted and walked through the logic a dozen times, and still she did not know if she could trust what she had found. The potatoes might rot. The grain might spoil. The meat might go bad before she learned how to keep it safe. But she could not operate the vault alone. She needed information, guidance, confirmation that the food was sound. She needed someone who understood cellaring. Bridget Coyle knew more about keeping vegetables through winter than anyone else in Pine Coulee. "I need to show you something," Eli said. Bridget descended the ladder with the caution of a woman who did not trust promises. She held the rope with white-knuckled hands and tested every rung twice before putting her full weight on it. When she reached the bottom and saw the door, her face changed. "What is this?" "My father's work." Eli lifted the latch and pushed the door open. Bridget stepped through and stopped. She looked at the bins, the barrels, the hanging meat. She looked at the chalkboard and the sand around the roots, and the netted shelves holding onions above the moisture line. She looked at everything, and her expression moved through disbelief into something harder to name. "Aslak built this?" "Yes." "He was digging a cellar." "He was building a vault." Bridget walked to the nearest bin and pulled out a potato. She turned it over in her hands, pressed her thumb against the skin, lifted it to her nose, and smelled it. Then she did the same with a carrot, a turnip, an onion. She opened a grain barrel and let the wheat run through her fingers. "It is sound," she said slowly. "All of it. The roots, the grain. This is 6 months' stores, maybe more." "That is what I thought." Bridget looked at her. "You did not know what you had?" "I knew nothing. He never told me. I found a note in his papers after he died. It said the well was not dry. It said it was finished." "Finished?" Bridget laughed, but there was no humor in it. "He was finished 10 years ago, and nobody knew." She set the potato back in the bin and stood in the center of the chamber, turning slowly to take it all in. "Do you understand what this means?" she said. "I think so." "No, you do not. Not yet." Bridget's voice was sharp now. "This food is sound today. It may not be sound in a month. Cellars fail. Moisture comes. Temperature shifts. Rot spreads. One bad corner can take a whole bin if you do not catch it early." "I know." "You know nothing. You have never run a cellar in your life." Eli did not argue. It was true. Bridget turned to face her, arms still crossed. "Buried food goes bad. Damp ruins it. Bad air ruins it. Mice ruin it. And even if it is sound today, what do you know about keeping it sound through January?" "That is why I showed you. I need to learn." "From me?" "From anyone who will teach me." Bridget was quiet for a long time. The lantern flame flickered in the still air. Somewhere above them, through 30 feet of shaft and stone, the wind was moving across the coulee. "Your father was a strange man," Bridget said finally. "I thought he was a fool. Half the camp thought he was a fool, but this is not the work of a fool." She walked to the chalkboard and studied the marks. "These are his records?" "Yes." "Vent positions, temperature notes, entry dates." Bridget traced the columns with her finger. "He was tracking everything, every variable that matters." "Can you read it?" "Most of it. Some of these symbols I do not recognize, but the logic is clear." She turned back to Eli. "He understood cellaring better than I do. Better than anyone I've met." "Then the food is safe?" "The food is safe if you keep doing what he did, if you follow his rules, if you check the vents, monitor the temperature, rotate the stock, cull rot before it spreads." Bridget's voice softened slightly. "It is work, every day. You cannot walk away and assume it will hold." "I can work." "Can you? For 4 months, 5? With a child to feed and a stove to tend and no one to help you?" Eli met her eyes. "I do not have a choice." Bridget stared at her for a long moment. Then she exhaled, a sound that might have been a sigh or might have been surrender. "Show me the vents." They spent 3 hours in the chamber that first day. Bridget showed Eli how to read the vent positions, how to feel for moisture on the wood, how to identify the first signs of rot in a potato before the softness spread. She explained why onions went high and dry, why root vegetables needed sand, why grain had to stay off the floor even when the floor seemed dry. Eli listened. She asked questions. She took notes on a scrap of paper she had brought down with her, writing by lantern light while Bridget talked. When they climbed back up, Bridget stood at the headframe and looked at Eli with an expression that was not quite approval, but was no longer dismissal. "You cannot tell anyone," Eli said. "Why not?" "Because the moment people know, they will come, and I do not know who I can trust." Bridget nodded slowly. "Milo Haskins will want it. He will use the debt against you. He will find a way to take it if he can." "That is what I thought." "So what will you do?" Eli looked at the shaft collar, at the gray wood of the head frame, at the coulee stretching down toward the grade and the town beyond. "I will learn the system," she said. "I will keep it running, and I will stay alive until spring." The secret lasted 9 days. Niels told another boy at the boarding house that his grandfather's well was cold inside. The other boy told his mother. The mother mentioned it to a neighbor. The neighbor said something to the freighter who hauled her flour, and by the end of the first week of October, half of Pine Coulee had heard that Aslak Vangen's dry well was not dry at all, and that his daughter was pulling food from it like water from a spring. Milo Haskins heard it on the 9th day. He came to the acre at noon when the light was flat and gray, and the first real chill of autumn was in the air. He did not knock on the shack door. He stood at the headframe and waited, his hands in the pockets of his wool coat, his breath steaming in the cold. Eli saw him from the window. She told Niels to stay inside and not to open the door for anyone. Then she went out to meet him. Milo Haskins was 43 years old. He owned the company store that served Pine Coulee and the 3 camps above it. He extended credit to minors and widows and anyone else who could not pay cash, and he collected interest at rates that made men work twice as long to clear their debts. He was not tall, but he carried himself like a man who had never been told no by anyone who mattered. "Mrs. Vangen," he said. "Mr. Just Haskins. I hear your father left you something interesting." Eli did not answer. She watched his face. Milo smiled. It was not a kind smile. "The story going around town is that old Aslak was digging a root cellar all along, that he filled it with food before he died, that his daughter has been pulling potatoes out of the ground like magic tricks. Stories grow in the telling." "They do." Milo looked at the head frame. "But stories usually start somewhere true." He stepped closer to the shaft collar and peered down into the darkness. "Your father owed me $18 when he died. That debt passes to you, plus interest." He looked at her. "You understand that?" "I understand." "And your husband owed another 12 before his accident. That debt also passes to you." Eli said nothing. $30 in debt. Against $47 in cash, and now everyone knew about the vault. Milo pulled a folded paper from his coat pocket. "I have a proposal," he said. "A fair one, I think. I will forgive both debts in full, the 18 and the 12. In exchange, you sign over the acre to me as security. If you make it through winter, the acre stays yours. If you fail, it becomes mine." He held out the paper. Eli did not take it. "What you are offering," she said slowly, "is not forgiveness. It is purchase. You're betting I will fail, and you will own the vault." Milo's smile did not waver. "I am offering you a chance. Without my help, you have $47 and winter coming. With my help, your debts are cleared and you have a path forward." He shrugged. "Unless you think cemetery turnips are going to keep that boy of yours fed." "Cemetery turnips. That is what the men are calling it. Food your father pulled from a grave." Milo folded the paper and put it back in his pocket. "Think about it. Come see me when you're ready to be practical. He turned and walked down the grade toward town. Eli watched him until he was out of sight. Then she went back inside, drove 4 iron spikes through the shaft cover, and began her inventory again. The days that followed were a war against time, doubt, and whispers. Eli worked from dawn until her arms ached, and then worked past the aching until her hands could not grip, and then rested just long enough for the strength to return. She cleared rot from the outer layer of the potato bins, and carried the spoiled ones up in buckets, and buried them far from the shaft. She tested every grain barrel for moisture, and resealed the lids with rendered tallow. She learned to read the vents the way her father had, adjusting the slide panels at dusk when the moisture changed, cutting the flow at dawn when the cold bit too deep. Bridget came when she could, which was not often. She had her own boarding house to run, her own shallow cellar to tend, her own struggles that had nothing to do with Eli's vault. But she taught what she could in stolen hours, showing Eli how to pack carrots deeper in sand, how to cull onions before soft spots spread, how to read the chalk marks Aslack had left, and translate them into rules she could follow. The work was relentless. But the work was also the answer. October ground forward. The first frost came and hardened the ground. The trees on the ridgeline lost their leaves and stood bare against the gray sky. Eli counted days the way a prisoner counts days, marking each one against the arrival of the storm she knew was coming. Harlon Pike came back in the 3rd week of October. He did not come with freight. He came alone, walking up the grade with his hands in his pockets and his hat pulled low against the wind. He stood at the head frame and looked at the improvements Eli had made, the new rope on the windlass, the tightened cover, the small shed she was building over the collar to protect the opening from rain and drift. "I heard about what you found," he said. "Everyone has heard. And I heard Milo came to see you." Eli said nothing. She kept working, tightening a rope joint, not looking at him. "He's not wrong, you know." Harlan's voice was quiet. "About the math. One cellar, no matter how well stocked, does not change what winter does to a woman alone on a hill. The math is different now." "Is it?" He walked closer, studying the work she had done. "You have food. Maybe. For now. But the road will close. The wood will run out. The shaft will freeze if the cover fails. And if anything goes wrong down there, if the temperature shifts or the moisture changes, you will have nothing." Eli stopped working. She looked at him. "You came to tell me I will fail. I came to tell you that I do not understand why you are still here." Harlan shook his head. "I have seen women survive winter alone. Some of them. Not many. And none of them did it by trusting a hole in the ground. This is not a hole. It is a vault. It is still underground. And underground food is underground food, no matter what you call it." Eli felt the anger rise in her chest, hot and sharp. She let it rise. She did not try to push it down. "My father spent 10 years building that vault," she said. 10 years while you and everyone else laughed at him. 10 years while the camp called him a fool and a failure and a man who could not even find water. He knew what he was doing. He understood something none of you understood. And now you want me to walk away from it because the math scares you." Harlan said nothing. "The math scared me too," Eli continued. "It still scares me, but I have counted what is down there. I have tested it. I have eaten from it, and it is sound. It is better than sound. It is ready for winter. And if it fails, then it fails, and I die here with my boy. The same way I would die anywhere else if I gave up now." The wind gusted between them. Harlan pulled his coat tighter. "You have more grit than your father," he said at last. "I will give you that. I have his work. That is better than grit." Harlon looked at her for a long moment. Then he reached into his coat and pulled out a coil of chain, heavy iron, 20 feet of it, the kind used to secure loads on a freight wagon. "For the windlass," he said, "in case the rope snaps." He set the chain on the ground beside the head frame and walked away without another word. The chain was not charity. Eli understood that. Harlon Pike did not believe in charity. He believed in paying debts and keeping accounts straight and not owing anyone anything that could be called against him later. The chain was a bet. He was betting that she might not fail, that she might be right about the vault, that the crazy Norwegian's daughter might be crazy too, but maybe crazy in a way that worked. It was not much, but it was more than she had gotten from anyone else. She installed the chain that afternoon. She replaced the frayed rope on the windlass with new cord she had braided from scrap, and she added the chain as a backup, running it over the drum and down into the shaft where it could bear weight if everything else gave way. Then she went back into the chamber and began the work of preparing for winter. The first snow came on the last day of October. Light flakes, nothing serious, but a warning. Eli watched them fall from the window of the shack while Niels ate his supper, and she calculated how much time she had left. The road was still open. The vault was still stable. The wood was still short. She had made progress. But progress was not victory. Progress was a battle won in a war that had barely begun. That night, after Niels was asleep, she sat at the table with her father's notes and tried to understand the system he had built. Vent positions, temperature ranges, rotation schedules. The marks on the chalkboard were a language, and she was learning to read it word by word, rule by rule. Outside, the wind picked up. The first true cold front was coming. And somewhere above her, on the ridgeline that ran down toward Ravengrade, she could hear the groan of settling snow. The vault was ready. She was not sure if she was. November came with teeth. The temperature dropped 15 degrees in 3 days. The ground froze hard enough that Eli's shovel bounced off it when she tried to dig drainage around the headframe. The wind shifted north and stayed there, carrying the smell of snow that had not yet fallen but was gathering somewhere beyond the ridgeline. She had made progress in the weeks since discovering the vault. The windlass was sound. The chain backup was installed. The shed over the collar was framed and half-roofed, enough to deflect rain but not yet sturdy enough to hold against drift. The vents were working, drawing air down one shaft and releasing it through another, keeping the chamber temperature steady at 37 degrees by the cheap mercury thermometer she had hung near the door. But the wood situation had not improved. Half a cord had become 3/8 of a cord, and she was burning faster than she had planned because October had been colder than expected. At the current rate, she would run out of fuel by mid-December, maybe earlier if the temperature kept dropping. And the timber on the acre was scrub pine, half dead and poor burning, the kind that threw sparks and left more ash than heat. She was standing at the head frame, calculating whether she could afford to hire anyone to cut and haul wood from the better stands below the grade, when a voice came from behind her. "You have the rope running over the drum wrong." Eli turned. A man she did not recognize was standing 10 feet away, studying the windlass with the critical eye of someone who had built 100 of them. He was old. 60, maybe older. His face was weathered leather, creased and brown, and his hands were thick with calluses that looked like they had been built over decades. He wore a wool coat patched at the elbows, and a hat that might have been black once but had faded to charcoal gray. "Who are you?" Eli asked. "Toliff Asen." He pronounced it the Norwegian way, the vowels soft and rolling. "I worked with your father 15 years ago, before he quit the drift." "I do not remember you." "You were a child, and I was underground most of the time." He walked closer to the windlass and tapped the drum with one scarred knuckle. The rope should run the other direction, counter to the crank. You have it wound so it will bind when you lower a loaded bucket. Eli looked at the drum. She had wound it the way her father had shown her years ago, but she had been young and had not been paying attention. You know windlasses, she said. I know mine work. Your father built this like a prospect shaft, which means he built it right. But you have been using it like a well bucket, and that will get someone killed. Toliff pulled a short-handled hammer from his belt and tapped the drum again, listening to the sound. Oak, he said. Good oak. And the iron is seated properly. Your father knew what he was doing. Did you know what he was doing? Toliff looked at her. His eyes were pale blue, almost gray, and there was something in them that was not quite humor, but was close. I knew he was building something. I did not know what. When he quit the drift, he said he had a project that would take 10 years. Everyone thought he meant the well. Toliff shrugged. Everyone was wrong. You heard about the vault. I heard, and I came to see if the stories were true. He looked toward the shaft collar. May I? Eli hesitated. She had been careful about who she let down into the chamber. Bridget knew. Milo suspected, but had not seen. Harlon had not asked. But Toliff Asen had known her father. He had worked beside him in the dark. And he was looking at the head frame the way a carpenter looks at work he respects. The ladder rungs need testing, she said. I've not replaced them yet. I will be careful. Toliff descended the shaft with the ease of a man who had spent most of his life underground. He tested each rung before committing his weight, but he moved steadily, without fear, and when he reached the bottom, he stood for a moment in silence before pushing open the oak door. Eli followed him down. She held the lantern high so he could see everything. The bins, the barrels, the hanging meat, the chalkboard with her father's marks. Toliff walked the perimeter of the chamber without speaking. He touched the timber bracing. He felt the temperature of the stone walls. He knelt and scooped a handful of sand from around the carrots, rubbing it between his fingers. He opened a grain barrel and let the wheat run through his palm. When he finally spoke, his voice was quiet. Aslak was a better man than I gave him credit for. What do you mean? I mean, this is not a cellar. This is a drift chamber. He built it the way we build underground storage in the mines. Timber sets, drainage angles, ventilation balance to prevent condensation. Toliff looked at the vent openings in the ceiling. The air moves like it would in a working drift. He understood something most surface people never learn. What? That temperature is not the same as preservation. Cold alone does not save food. Controlled cold does. Balanced moisture does. Air that moves does. Toliff turned to face her. Your father built a system. Most cellars are just holes. This is a machine. Eli felt something loosen in her chest. She had believed in the vault. She had worked to understand it. But hearing Toliff say it, hearing a man who had spent decades underground confirm what she had suspected, was different from believing alone. Can you teach me how to run it? She asked. Toliff raised an eyebrow. You have been running it. I have been guessing. I read my father's marks, but I do not understand all of them. I watch the temperature, but I do not know what to do if it changes. I rotate the stock, but I do not know if I am rotating it correctly. Toliff studied her face for a long moment. Why should I teach you? Because my father trusted you. Because you knew him when he was building this. Because you are the only person in Pine Coulee who looks at this chamber and sees what it actually is instead of what they expected it to be. And what is it? A chance, Eli said. For me and my son. Maybe for others if I can make it last. Toliff was silent. The lantern flame flickered in the still air. Somewhere above them, the wind was moving across the coulee, and Eli could feel the faint draft that meant the vents were working. "One day," Toliff said finally, "I will give you 1 day to prove you're worth teaching. If you learn fast, I will come back. If you do not, I will not waste my time or yours. 1 day is enough. We will see." The 1 day became 2, then 3, then a standing arrangement that neither of them named but both of them kept. Toliff came to the acre every other morning, arriving at first light when the air was coldest and the vault conditions were most stable. He brought tools, a hand auger for testing timber soundness, a chalk line for checking vertical, a small mirror he used to reflect lantern light into corners the direct flame could not reach. He taught the way men who have worked underground teach, by doing, not by lecturing. On the first morning, he made Eli test every timber brace in the chamber by tapping it with the hammer and listening to the tone. A solid timber rang. A compromised timber thudded. She found 2 braces that were beginning to soften at the base where moisture had crept up from the floor. "Replace them," Toliff said. "This week, before the cold sets the rot." "With what? I have no timber." "You have scrub pine on the acre. Cut 4 pieces, peel the bark, let them dry for 3 days near the stove, and set them before the first hard freeze." Eli cut the timber that afternoon. She peeled the bark with a drawn knife Toliff lent her. She stacked the pieces near the stove and turned them twice a day to dry evenly. By the end of the week, she had replaced both braces, and Toliff tapped the new wood and nodded once. "You learn fast," he said. "Your father was the same." The second week, Toliff taught her the vents. The chamber had 2 ventilation shafts, each one running from the ceiling up through the rock and soil to the surface. One vent pulled air down, the other released it up, and the difference in pressure created circulation. But the vents had sliding shutters at the surface, and the position of the shutters changed everything. "Open too wide in wet weather, you bring in moisture," Toliff explained. "Open too narrow in dry cold, you let the temperature drop too fast and freeze the outer roots. Close too long, you get dead air and mold. The trick is balance." "How do I know what balance is?" "You learn by watching. You learn by testing. You learn by ruining a few bushels of potatoes before you understand." Toliff adjusted the shutter on the intake vent, pulling it from half open to quarter open. "Your father left notes. Study them. But notes are not the same as instinct. Your instinct takes time." Eli studied the notes. She watched the temperature. She felt the air in the chamber every morning, checking for moisture, smelling for the first hint of mold. Twice she adjusted the shutters wrong and found condensation on the ceiling the next day. Toliff showed her how to wipe it down with dry cloth before it dripped onto the grain barrels. "Mistakes are how you learn," he said. "The question is whether you survive them." The third week, Toliff taught her rotation. Old stock first, always, no exceptions. He pointed to the potatoes in the front of the nearest bin. "These came in first. They go out first. The ones in the back are newer, harder, more stable. You eat toward the door and you restock from the back." "What about seed stock?" Toliff's expression changed. Something crossed his face that was harder, older, shaped by memories Eli could not see. "Seed stock is sacred," he said. "You never touch seed stock in a panic. You starve before you touch it. Because if you eat your seed, you have nothing to plant in spring. You survive the winter and die in summer. Understand?" "I understand." "You say you understand, but when your boy is hungry in January and the seed potatoes are the only food left, you will be tempted. Every parent is tempted." He met her eyes. "Do not give in." By mid-November, Eli had learned enough to run the vault without Toliff's daily guidance. She still made mistakes, but she caught them faster, and the mistakes were smaller. The temperature stayed stable, the moisture stayed balanced, the food stayed sound. But the wood situation was getting worse. 3/8 of a cord had become a quarter of a cord. Was the scrub pine on the acre burned too fast and gave off too little heat? She needed real firewood, good firewood, dense hardwood, or well-seasoned pine that would hold through the long nights. And she had no way to get it. She mentioned it to Toliff on a morning when the frost was thick on the head frame and her breath hung in the air like smoke. "How much do you need?" he asked. "4 cords to be safe, 3 to survive." "And you have?" "A quarter, maybe less." Toliff was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "I know a man in Spearfish who owes me a debt. He has timber he cannot move because his team is lame. I will talk to him." "I cannot pay." "I did not ask you to pay." 3 days later, a wagon came up the grade, carrying 2 cords of split oak. The driver was a young man named Peter Lunde, 34 years old, with the broad shoulders and steady hands of a man who had spent his life working with wood. He stacked the cords behind the shack without asking for payment, and when Eli tried to offer him coffee, he shook his head. "Toliff said you would offer," Peter said. "He said to refuse. He said to tell you the debt is between him and me, and you are not part of it." "I do not like owing debts I did not choose." "Then consider it a loan." Peter touched the brim of his hat. "I make barrels. If your grain stores hold through winter, you may need new ones by spring. We can settle the account then." He climbed back onto the wagon and drove down the grade. Eli watched him go, then turned back to the wood. 2 cords. Enough for 6 weeks, maybe 8 if she burned careful. Added to what she had, it gave her a fighting chance. That night, where she told Toliff what Peter had said. "You planned that," she said. "I mentioned your situation. He made his own choice." "Why?" Toliff was quiet for a long moment. The fire crackled in the stove. Outside, the wind was picking up, carrying the first flakes of what would be a 3-day snow. "Because some people are worth helping," he said finally, "and some people are worth teaching. Your father was both. You may be the same." December came hard. The temperature dropped into the single digits and stayed there. The road to Deadwood became uncertain, wagons turning back when drift blocked the grade. Prices at Milo Haskins' store climbed higher, 5 cents more for flour, 10 cents more for salt pork, and the complaints grew louder, but the payments kept coming because no one had any other choice. Eli checked the vault every morning. The temperature held at 36 degrees, sometimes 37. The potatoes were firm. The carrots were crisp in their sand. The onions hung dry and papery on the high shelves. The grain showed no sign of mold or weevil, but she was burning wood faster than she had planned. The 2 cords from Peter Lunde were down to 1.5. Her original quarter cord was gone. At the current rate, she would run out by the 3rd week of January, maybe sooner if the cold deepened. She mentioned it to Toliff on a morning when the frost was so thick on the shack window that she could not see through the glass. "You're burning too hot," he said. "The temperature inside drops below 50 if I bank the fire. 50 is survivable. 40 is survivable if you have blankets." He looked at the stove, at the wood stacked beside it, at the draft coming through the cracks in the walls. "Your father insulated this shack poorly. He spent all his time on the vault and none on the house." "Can I fix it?" "Not now, not in December." Toliff walked to the wall and pressed his hand against the boards. "But you can stuff the cracks with moss. You can hang blankets over the window at night. You can sleep with the boy and share body heat instead of burning wood to make up the difference." Eli did all of it. She gathered moss from the north side of the ridge and stuffed it into every crack she could reach. She hung her father's old coat over the window after dark and took it down at dawn to let in light. She pulled Niels into her bed and held him close through the coldest hours, feeling his small body warm against hers. The wood lasted longer. Not much longer, but enough. Mid-December brought a moment of calm. The temperature stabilized around 10 degrees above zero. The sky cleared. The road to Deadwood opened for 3 days, and freight moved again, and for a brief window the camp felt almost normal. Harlon Pike came up to the acre on the second clear day. He did not bring chain this time. He brought information. "There is talk of a bad winter coming," he said. "The old-timers are reading the signs. Heavy snow in the mountains. Ice forming early on the creeks. Animals moving lower than usual." "When?" "January, maybe sooner." Harlon looked at the head frame, at the shed that now covered the collar completely, at the vent boxes with their sliding shutters. "You have improved things." "I have had help." "Toliff Asen." Harlon nodded. "I heard he was coming up here. He's a good man. He knows his work." "He knew my father." "Everyone knew your father. Not everyone understood him." Harlon paused. "I did not understand him. I thought he was wasting his time. I thought the well was a failure. I was wrong." Eli said nothing. She waited. "I still think you're taking a risk," Harlon continued. "One woman, one child, one underground vault. It is not how winter gets survived. It is not how it has ever been done." "Then it will be the first time." Harlon smiled, just slightly, the corners of his mouth turning up beneath his gray mustache. "Maybe so. Maybe so." He looked toward the grade, toward the town below, toward the mountains where the bad winter was gathering. "If the road closes, there will be people in trouble, people who did not prepare, people who trusted the store and the freight and the usual way of doing things." "I know. You have food enough for more than 2. Eli met his eyes. "I know that too." Harlon held her gaze for a long moment. Then he nodded once and walked back down the grade without another word. The calm ended on Christmas Eve. The temperature dropped 20 degrees in 6 hours. The wind shifted north and began to blow with a force that rattled the shack walls and sent snow streaming horizontal across the coulee. By midnight, the road to Deadwood was impassable. By dawn, the drifts were 4 feet deep on the grade and climbing. Eli checked the vault at first light. The temperature inside had dropped to 34 degrees, which was fine. The potatoes were holding. The moisture was balanced. Everything her father had built was working exactly as designed, but everything above ground was failing. She could hear the camp waking up below, voices calling through the wind, doors slamming, the panic that comes when people realize they are cut off. Milo Haskins's store would be emptied by noon if people started buying in fear. The boarding house would run short within a week. The bachelor miners in the uppercut, the ones who lived on whiskey and optimism, would be in trouble before the snow stopped falling. Niels was awake, watching her from the bed. "Is it bad?" he asked. "It is winter," she said. "Winter is always bad." "But is it the bad winter, the one Mr. Pike talked about?" Eli looked at her son. 6 years old. He understood more than she had given him credit for. Or I think it might be. She built up the fire and made him breakfast, porridge with a small piece of salt pork, the same breakfast she had been making for weeks, and then she bundled him in every piece of clothing he owned and told him to stay by the stove. "I have to check on things," she said. "I may be gone for an hour. Do not open the door for anyone." "Not even Toliff?" "Toliff will knock 3 times. Anyone else you do not answer." She kissed his forehead and went out into the storm. The crisis arrived in full on January 8, 1881. The temperature dropped to 17 degrees below zero. The wind carried ice crystals that cut exposed skin like glass. The snow that had been falling for 2 weeks packed into drifts that buried fences, blocked doors, and turned the road into a memory. Eli stood at the headframe that morning and looked out over a world transformed. The coulee was white and silent. No wagons moved on the grade. No smoke rose from the bachelor cabins at the upper cut. The only motion was the snow itself, still falling, still driven by wind that had not stopped blowing since Christmas. She had been preparing for this. For 2 weeks she had been rationing, cutting portions, stretching supplies, calculating how long the vault could last if she opened it to more than her own household. She had made lists. She had done arithmetic. She had prepared herself for the moment when preparation met reality. But preparation was not the same as living through it. The first knock came at noon. It was Bridget Coyle, her face raw from cold, her eyes red from wind and something else. She stood at the door of the shack and did not come inside. "My cellar froze," she said. "The shallow pit under the boarding house. The cabbages are solid. The potatoes are ruined. I have maybe 3 days of food left for 12 people. Eli did not hesitate. "Come to the vault at dusk. Bring baskets. We will work out a system." Bridget nodded. Her lips were cracked and bleeding from the cold. "Milo is doubling prices, tripling for some things. The men are getting angry." "Let them be angry. It will keep them warm." The second knock came an hour later. It was a miner named Shure Brecka, a young man with frostbite on his ears and panic in his eyes. His wife was pregnant, due in February, and they had run out of flour 2 days ago. Milo would not extend credit without collateral, and they had nothing left to offer. "I heard you have stores," Shure said. "I heard you have food down in the well." "I have food, not unlimited." "Enough for my wife, just until the road opens?" Eli looked at him. He was shaking from cold or fear or both. "Come at dusk. Bring a basket. We will work out a system." The third knock came at mid-afternoon. It was Milo Haskins himself. He stood at the headframe, not at the door, and he was not asking. He was stating. "You are undercutting my prices," he said. "You are giving away food that people should be buying from me." "I am not giving anything away. I am sharing what I have with people who have nothing." "Sharing." Milo's voice was hard. "That's a pretty word for theft." "Theft from whom?" "From the market. From the system. From me." He stepped closer. "I have a store to run. I have credit to collect. I have costs that do not go away because the road closes. If you start feeding people for free, you destroy everything I have built." Eli felt the anger rise in her chest, the same anger she had felt when Harlon told her she would fail, the same anger she had carried since the day Milo offered to buy her acre for her father's debts. "What you have built," she said slowly, "is a system that profits from hunger. You raise prices when people are desperate. You extend credit to trap them. You wait for them to fail so you can take what they have. That is business. That is cruelty wearing a ledger." Milo's face reddened. "You are a widow with a hole in the ground. You have no right to lecture me about." "I have stores," Eli interrupted. "I have food that will last through winter. I have a vault that my father built while you mocked him. And I will feed whoever needs feeding on whatever terms I choose. And there is nothing you can do to stop me." Milo stared at her. The wind gusted between them, throwing snow across the head frame and dusting his coat with white. "We will see," he said. "We will see what happens when your charity runs out and you come begging to my door." He turned and walked back toward town. Eli watched him go. Then she went inside and began preparing for dusk. The system she built was simple. Families came to the head frame at appointed times. They brought baskets. Eli lowered buckets into the vault and filled the baskets with whatever she thought they needed. Potatoes for large families, grain for those who could bake, salt pork for the sick. She kept a ledger, so she's marking what went out and to whom, not for payment, but for tracking. Bridget Coyle became her partner. The boarding house had the only stove large enough to cook for groups, so the food went there and Bridget stretched it into thin stew and hard bread and portions that were small but warm. Nobody ate well, but nobody starved. The vault held. Eli checked it every morning and every evening. The temperature stayed steady. The ventilation kept the air moving. The potatoes came up firm, the carrots crisp, the onions dry. Everything her father had designed was working, and everything Toliff had taught her was proving true. But the crisis was not over. On January 15th, Niels woke with a fever. Eli was in the vault when she heard him coughing above. She climbed the ladder faster than she had ever climbed it, her hands scraping on the rungs, her heart pounding in her chest. When she reached the shack, Niels was curled in the bed, his face flushed, his breathing shallow and wet. Chest fever. The same sickness that killed children every winter. The same sickness that had taken 3 of Bridget's boarders the year before. Eli built up the fire. She wrapped Niels in every blanket she had. She made broth from salt pork and gave it to him 1 spoonful at a time. And she prayed, not to God exactly, but to whatever force governed the world, that her son would live to see spring. For 3 days she did not leave the shack. Toliff came and took over the vault operations, lowering buckets for the families who came at dusk, keeping the system running while Eli sat beside her son's bed and watched him breathe. On the 3rd night, the fever broke. Niels opened his eyes and looked at her, and his voice was weak but clear. "Mama, is it still winter?" "Yes," she said. "It is still winter, but you're going to be fine." She held him close and wept for the first time since her father died. The crisis deepened in the last week of January. The temperature dropped again to 20 below, and the wind returned with renewed fury. The drifts on Raven Grade reached 8 feet in places. A bachelor from the upper cut, a man named Inger who had trusted whiskey more than preparation, was found frozen in his cabin. He had been dead for 2 days before anyone noticed. The camp buried him in a shallow grave scraped from frozen ground, and Harlon Pike said words over the body because there was no preacher. Eli stood at the edge of the gathering and looked at the faces around her. Bridget, hollow-eyed from exhaustion. Sure Brecca, holding his pregnant wife's hand. A dozen others, thin and frightened and cold. They were alive because of the vault, because of her father's work, because of what she had learned from Toliff and built with her own hands. But they were barely alive. The food was running low, the rationing was getting tighter, and winter was not done with them yet. That night, the windlass brake froze. Eli was lowering a loaded bucket when the mechanism locked. The bucket jerked, swung, and slammed against the shaft wall. The rope snapped taut with a sound like a gunshot, and the bucket jammed halfway down the shaft. She could not bring it up. She could not lower it down. The brake was locked, the rope was tangled, and 30 pounds of potatoes were stuck 20 feet underground. "I will go down," Toliff said. "No, you are too weak." Eli looked at him. The past 2 weeks had aged him. His face was drawn, his movements slower than they had been in November. The cold was taking its toll on everyone, but it was taking more from Toliff because he was older and had less to give. "Then who?" Toliff asked. "I will go." She tied a second rope around her waist, looped it over the chain back up, and lowered herself into the shaft. The cold was worse underground than she had expected. The frozen break had disrupted the ventilation, letting cold air pool at the bottom instead of circulating out. Her fingers went numb as she worked, prying at the tangled rope, freeing the bucket from where it had wedged against the wall. It took an hour. When she climbed back up, her hands were bleeding from the rope, and her body was shaking from cold and exhaustion. But the bucket was clear, the break was fixed, and the food was moving again. February came. The road was still closed. The drifts were still deep. But the temperature began to rise, slowly, a few degrees at a time. The killing cold retreated. The wind softened. The days grew longer by minutes, then by tens of minutes, then by half hours. Eli counted what remained in the vault. 42 bushels of potatoes, 8 bushels of root vegetables, 22 pounds of onions, 2 barrels of grain nearly empty, 12 pounds of salt pork, no ham. It was not enough to last through March, but it might be enough to last until the road opened. She had learned to read the sky the way her father had, the way Toliff had, the way Harlon read the grade and the drifts and the behavior of horses. She could feel the change coming. The worst was past. On February 23rd, the first wagon came up Raven Grade. Eli was at the head frame when she heard the sound, the creak of wheels, the snap of a whip, the shouting of a driver urging his team through the last of the drifts. She walked down the slope and stood at the edge of the road and watched the wagon crest the grade and come to a stop. Harlon Pike was driving. He climbed down from the seat and stood before her, his face red from wind, his eyes bright. "The road is open," he said. 2 days, maybe 3, before the next storm, but open. "You came yourself." "I had to see." He looked up at the head frame, at the shed, at the vents with their sliding shutters. "I had to see if you made it." "We made it." Harlon nodded slowly. He took off his hat and held it in his hands. "I owe you an apology," he said. "I told you that hole would not feed your boy. I told you he would starve in your arms. I was wrong. You were saying what you believed. I was saying what I had always believed, what I had seen before, but I had never seen this." He gestured at the head frame at the camp below, at the thin trails of smoke rising from chimneys that would have been cold if not for the vault. "You did something new, something I did not think was possible." Eli looked at him. Her hands were scarred from rope. Her face was thin from rationing. She had not slept a full night in 2 months. "I did not do it alone," she said. "My father built the vault. Toliff taught me how to use it. You brought chain when I needed it. Bridget ran the kitchen. Everyone carried weight. But you carried the most." Eli did not argue. It was true. "What happens now?" Harlon asked. Eli looked at the head frame, at the shaft that led down to her father's work, at the chamber that had kept a camp alive through the worst winter anyone could remember. "Now I learn how to do it better," she said, "and I teach others how to do it at all." The first carts came up the grade within a week, carrying flour and salt, and the supplies that had been trapped in Pierre all winter. The camp ate better. The children grew stronger. The fear that had gripped everyone for months began to loosen its hold. But the vault had changed things. People who had laughed at Aslak Vangen's dry well now came to Eli with questions. Where should they dig? How deep? What angle for the vents? How much sand for the carrots? She answered as best she could, drawing on her father's notes and Toliff's teaching and her own hard-won experience. Bridget Coyle was the first to start digging. She came to the acre in early March, when the frost was beginning to loosen, and she asked Eli to walk her property and show her where to start. "I want what you have," Bridget said. Not to take from you, to build for myself. Eli walked the boarding house lot and pointed to a slope on the north side, where the ground dropped away toward the creek and the drainage would be natural. Here, she said, dig down, not across. Get below the frost line before you chamber out, and make sure you have 2 vents, not 1. Bridget started digging the next day. The vault had kept the camp alive. Now it was beginning to change how the camp lived. The thaw came slowly, reluctantly, as if winter did not want to admit defeat. By mid-March, the drifts on Ravengrade had melted enough for regular wagon traffic. By the end of the month, the road was clear down to the valley floor. Freight moved again. Prices at Milo's store dropped back to normal, though not as far as they had been in autumn. The camp breathed easier, and people began to talk about spring planting and summer work, and all the ordinary concerns that winter had swept aside. But they also talked about the vault. Harlon Pike came back to the acre in the first week of April. He did not come alone. He brought 2 men from Deadwood, businessmen in clean coats who had heard about the widow on the coulee shelf and wanted to see what all the talk was about. Eli met them at the head frame. She did not invite them down. Mrs. Vangen, the first man said, tipping his hat. He was thin, with spectacles and a ledger book tucked under his arm. My name is Addison Crane. I represent a consortium of investors interested in food storage solutions for the mining districts. Storage solutions, Eli repeated. Precisely. We have heard remarkable things about your facility, the temperature stability, the preservation rates, the capacity. We would like to discuss a business arrangement. Eli looked at Harlon. His face was carefully neutral. What kind of arrangement? She asked. A partnership, Crane said. We would provide capital for expansion. You would provide expertise and oversight. The profits would be shared according to terms we could negotiate. And the vault itself? Crane smiled. Well, it was the smile of a man who had negotiated many deals and won most of them. The vault would become a company asset, protected, of course, improved, scaled up to serve the entire district, not just one small camp. Eli understood immediately what he was offering. Capital in exchange for ownership, expertise in exchange for control. The same arrangement Milo had tried to force on her with debt, dressed in cleaner language. No, she said. Crane's smile flickered. I beg your pardon? No. The vault is not for sale. The vault is not for partnership. The vault is mine, and the knowledge of how to build one is free to anyone who asks. Free? Crane looked genuinely confused. Mrs. Vanyan, you're sitting on a valuable asset. The techniques your father developed, like the system you have refined, these have commercial potential that you may not fully appreciate. I appreciate it. I do not want it. Harlan stepped forward. Gentlemen, I think Mrs. Vangen has made her position clear. Crane looked at him, then back at Eli. His expression hardened slightly. You are making a mistake, he said. Without capital, you cannot scale. Without scale, you cannot serve the district. And without serving the district, you are nothing more than a curiosity, a widow with a hole in the ground. I have been called worse, Eli said, by better men. She turned and walked back toward the shack. Behind her, she heard Harlan saying something polite and dismissive, guiding the businessman back down the grade. She did not look back. The conversion of the practical skeptic came not in a single moment, but in stages. Bridget Coyle had started digging in March. By April, she had a shaft 6 feet deep and was beginning to understand why Aslak had spent 10 years on his. The rock beneath the boarding house lot was harder than she had expected, fractured in places, soft in others. She broke 2 shovels before Eli came down to look. You are fighting the ground, Eli said. You need to read it instead. Read it how? Eli knelt beside the shaft and ran her hand along the exposed stone. She had learned this from Toliff, the way different rock types felt under the palm, the way fractures could be followed instead of crossed. "Here," she said, pointing to a seam that ran diagonal through the wall. "This is your path. The rock is weaker along this line. Dig with it, not against it." Bridget looked at the seam. She looked at Eli. "You learned this from the old Norwegian?" "From Toliff, and from my father's notes, and from making mistakes." Bridget picked up her shovel. She positioned it along the seam and struck. The rock crumbled more easily than it had before. "I did not believe you," Bridget said quietly, "when you first showed me the vault. I thought you were fooling yourself. I thought the food would rot, and you would come crawling to me for help." "I know." "And then the winter came, and my cellar froze, and yours held, and I ate from your stores while my own turned to ice in the ground." She struck the rock again. "I was wrong about you, about your father, about all of it." Eli said nothing. There was nothing to say. "Teach me," Bridget said, "not just where to dig, everything, the vents, the moisture, the rotation, all of it." "I will." They worked together until dark, deepening the shaft foot by foot, following the seam. When Eli finally climbed out, her hands were bleeding and her shoulders ached, but the hole was 3 feet deeper than it had been at dawn. Bridget would have a vault by autumn. Not as large as Eli's, not as deep, but sound, the first copy of her father's work. The community transformation accelerated through April and May. Sieur Brecka came to the acre with his wife, who had delivered a healthy daughter in February while the camp was still snowed in. They wanted to know where to dig on their small plot near the uppercut. A widow named Marta Flatten came with her 2 grown sons, asking about vent design and timber cribbing. A miner named Gunder Tveit came alone, skeptical, but curious. Beishan left 3 hours later with a notebook full of measurements and a promise to return when he had questions. Eli answered them all. She drew diagrams on scraps of paper. She walked properties and pointed to drainage lines and frost depths. She repeated Toliff's lessons in her own words, adapting them for people who had never worked underground, who did not know the difference between a drift and a shaft, who thought a cellar was just a hole with a lid. The teaching was harder than the building. She discovered this slowly through frustration and failed explanations and the blank faces of people who heard her words but did not understand. "You're explaining the what?" Toliff told her one afternoon, watching her struggle to convey the logic of vent positioning to Gunder Tveit. "You need to explain the why." "The why is obvious. To you, not to them." Toliff was sitting on a stump near the headframe, his hands resting on his knees. He looked thinner than he had in winter, his face more deeply lined. "When I taught you, I showed you what happens when vents are wrong. You saw the condensation. You smelled the mold. You understood because you experienced the failure. They have not failed yet. They cannot feel what you feel. So I should let them fail? You should show them what failure looks like before they build. Take them into your vault on a humid day. Show them the corners where moisture collects. Let them see what almost went wrong." He paused. "Your father understood this. He built his knowledge through mistakes. 10 years of mistakes, most of them invisible. You inherited the result, not the process. Now you must give them the process, not just the result." Eli looked at him. The afternoon light caught the gray in his beard, the deep creases around his eyes. "You are tired," she said. "I am old." "Those are not the same thing." Toliff smiled, just slightly. "They're becoming the same thing. For me." He pushed himself up from the stump, moving slowly, carefully. I have taught you what I know. The rest you will learn by teaching others. That is how knowledge lives. It passes through hands, not books. He walked down the grade toward the town below. Eli watched him go, and she felt something shift in her chest, a weight settling that had not been there before. The disagreement came in late May. Milo Haskins had been quiet since the winter. His store had survived, but his prices had dropped, and the camp's attitude toward him had changed. People who had once accepted his credit without question now hesitated. People who had once bought from him because there was no alternative now looked toward the vaults rising on hillsides around the coulee. He came to the acre on a morning when Eli was teaching Bridget how to set timber braces in her nearly completed shaft. "Mrs. Vangen," Milo said. "A word." Eli climbed out of Bridget's hole and brushed the dirt from her hands. "What do you want?" "I want to propose a truce." Milo's voice was careful, measured. The winter was difficult. Words were said. Actions were taken. I think we can move past that now. A truce implies we are at war. Are we not? Milo spread his hands. You are teaching people to build their own storage. But you're giving away knowledge that undermines my business. You are changing the economy of this camp in ways that cost me money every day. I am teaching people to survive without depending on you. That is not war. That is progress. Milo's jaw tightened. Progress. He laughed, but there was no humor in it. You call it progress. I call it destruction. Do you know what happens when everyone has their own vault? When everyone can store their own food? The store closes. The credit system collapses. The camp loses its center. The camp's center was exploitation, Eli said. The camp's center was you profiting from hunger. That is not a center worth keeping. You are naive. You think you are helping these people, but you are making them weak. They will build their vaults and feel safe, and then they will forget how to work, how to trade, how to build something larger than their own little holes in the ground. Eli felt the anger rise in her chest, familiar now, almost comfortable. My father built a hole in the ground, she said, and that hole kept 29 people alive through the worst winter this camp has ever seen. What did your store do? Raised prices, demanded collateral, watched people starve while you counted your coins. I kept order. You kept control. Those are not the same thing. Milo stared at her. His face was red, his hands clenched at his sides. This is not over, he said. You think you have won something, but you have only begun. The world is larger than this camp, Mrs. Vangen, and the world does not reward charity. Yet the world rewards strength. Then I will be strong enough to give things away. Milo turned and walked down the grade. Bridget climbed out of her shaft and stood beside Eli, watching him go. He will not stop, Bridget said. No, he will not. What will you do? Eli looked at the head frame, at the vents, at the half-dozen shafts now visible on the hillsides around the coulee. I will keep building. I will keep teaching, and when he comes at me again, I will be ready. Toliff died in the second week of June. Eli found out from Peder Lunde, who came up the grade with a wagon load of barrel staves and a face that told her something was wrong before he opened his mouth. He went in his sleep, Peder said. 3 nights ago. They found him in his chair by the stove, his hands folded in his lap. The doctor said his heart just stopped. Eli said nothing. She stood at the head frame and looked out over the coulee, and the world seemed different than it had a moment before. He left you something, Peder said. He wrote it down before he died. A list. Tools, mostly. His chalk line, his auger, some papers with figures on them. He told me he would leave them. He also left a letter. Pater reached into his coat and pulled out a folded sheet of paper, creased and worn. He held it out. Eli took it. She did not open it. "I'm sorry," Pater said. "I know he meant something to you. He taught me how to keep my son alive." Pater nodded. He climbed back onto his wagon and drove down the grade, leaving Eli alone with the letter and the weight of what it represented. She opened it that night after Niels was asleep, sitting at the table by lantern light. The handwriting was cramped and careful, the letters formed with the precision of a man who had spent most of his life working with measurements. Eli, your father and I worked together for 6 years before he quit the drift. He was not an easy man to know. He did not talk when he could be silent. He did not explain when he could demonstrate. He held his knowledge like a miser holds coins, closed and protected, and reluctant to spend. But he spent it on that vault. Everything he learned underground, everything he figured out about temperature and moisture and air, he poured into that hole in the ground. I did not understand why until I saw what you did with it. He was building for you. He did not know how to say it. He probably did not know how to feel it. But he was building for you. And now you're building for others. And that is how knowledge should move, hand to hand, generation to generation. You do not need me anymore. You know what I know. You know more than I know, because you understand how to teach it, and I never did. Keep building. Keep teaching. And when your son is old enough, teach him too. That is how we stay alive after we die. Toliff. Eli folded the letter and set it on the table. She sat very still for a long time, and then she went outside and stood at the head frame in the dark. The stars were bright above the ridgeline. The air was cool and smelled of pine. Somewhere below, in the camp, a dog was barking. She had not cried when her father died. She had not cried when her husband died. She had cried when Niels recovered from his fever, but that was relief, not grief. Now she cried. So she stood at the head frame her father had built and wept for the man who had taught her to use it, and the sound of her grief was swallowed by the night until there was nothing left but silence and the weight of what came next. The secondary crisis came 2 weeks later. A diphtheria outbreak struck the upper camps above Deadwood. 3 children died in the first week. By the second week, the disease had spread to Pine Coulee, and Bridget Coyle's boarding house became a makeshift infirmary. Eli was not a doctor. She could not cure the sick, but she could feed them, and she understood now that food was medicine when medicine was not available. She worked without rest for 6 days. She lowered buckets of potatoes and carrots and onions. She made broth from the last of the salt pork and carried it down to the boarding house in covered pots. She organized the camp's new vault owners into a rotation, each family contributing what they could spare, the food pooling at Bridget's kitchen and going out as soup and bread to the sick. The disease took 5 people from Pine Coulee. 3 were children. 1 was an old woman who had survived the winter only to die in summer. 1 was Milo Haskins's niece, a girl of 8 who had played with Niels in better days. Milo came to the acre on the day of her burial. Eli was at the head frame, checking the vent positions, when she saw him climbing the grade. His face was gray, his eyes were red. He looked older than he had 2 weeks before, as if the death had aged him a decade. He stopped 10 feet from the head frame and stood there, not speaking. "I am sorry about your niece," Eli said. Milo nodded. His throat worked, but no words came out. "The food helped," Eli continued. "Bridget said the broth was what kept some of them strong enough to fight. I wish it could have saved everyone." Milo's face crumpled. It was a strange thing to see, a man who had always been hard and certain breaking apart in front of her. "My sister's only child," he said. His voice was rough. "I watched her grow up. I taught her to count money. I told her she would run the store someday. Eli said nothing. There was nothing to say. You fed the camp through winter, Milo said. You fed the sick through summer. You gave away what you could have sold. You shared what you could have hoarded. He looked at her, and something in his eyes had changed. I do not understand you. I am not difficult to understand. You are to me. He paused. I spent my whole life building something, a store, a business, a system. I thought that was what mattered. I thought if I controlled enough, if I owned enough, I would be safe. And now? Now my niece is dead. And the only food she ate in her last week came from your vault. The vault I mocked. The vault I tried to take from you. His voice broke. I tried to take it from you, and then it fed her. How do I live with that? Eli looked at him. She remembered all the anger she had felt, all the contempt, all the righteous fury at his exploitation and his greed. She let it go. You live with it by changing, she said. You build something different. You give instead of take. You teach instead of hoard. I do not know how. I did not know how either. I learned. Milo was silent for a long time. The wind moved across the coulee, rustling the grass that had grown up around the head frame. The store has supplies, he said finally. Lumber, nails, hardware. I cannot give them away. The business would fail, but I can sell them at cost to anyone who wants to build a vault. No profit, no credit terms, just materials for people who want to be ready for next winter. That is a start. It is not enough. It is never enough. That is why you keep going. Milo looked at her one more moment. Then he turned and walked back down the grade, slower than he had come, carrying something invisible that had not been there before. The summer of 1881 passed in a rhythm of building and teaching. 8 families completed vaults before the first frost. 3 more were halfway done and would finish by early winter. Yes, the Saturday dig days that Eli had started in spring became a regular institution, with children tamping sand and men setting poles and women comparing techniques for keeping onions dry. Eli's role in the camp had changed completely. She was no longer the widow with the hole in the ground, the object of pity or mockery or suspicion. She was the person who knew things. She was the person others came to with questions. She was the person who could look at a half-dug shaft and point to where the timber was weak, where the drainage would fail, where the vents needed repositioning. She did not charge for this. She did not ask for payment or credit or favors. She gave the knowledge freely, the way Toliff had given it to her, the way her father had given it to the ground. But she also kept working on her own operation. The original vault had served its purpose, but it was not perfect. The grain barrels were too crowded. The onion shelves were too close to the moisture from the roots. The vent shutters were difficult to adjust in bad weather. She built a second chamber. The dryer annex opened off the main room, connected by a short passage she dug through solid rock over the course of 3 weeks. It was smaller than the main chamber, maybe 8 by 10 feet, but it was dedicated to grain, seed, and dry goods. The temperature was cooler, the humidity lower, the ventilation separate from the root storage. She also built a surface sorting shed, a small structure over the head frame where fresh harvest could wait before going underground. Warm produce going straight into cold storage caused condensation. The shed solved that problem, giving the vegetables a day or two to stabilize before descending. By the time autumn came, the Vangen vault was no longer a single chamber. It was a system. Surface shed, main shaft, primary chamber, dryer annex, separate vent circuits for each zone. Her father had built the foundation. She had built the expansion, and she had done it without Toliff. That was the hardest part. Every decision she made, every adjustment she tried, she could hear his voice in her head, questioning, correcting, approving. But the voice was memory now, not presence. The hands that had taught hers were in the ground, and she was alone with the knowledge they had passed. Not alone. She had Niels. She had Bridget. She had the camp that was slowly learning to take care of itself. But Toliff had been the last link to her father's generation. He's the last person who had worked beside Aslak and understood what he was really building. With Toliff gone, Eli was the keeper of knowledge that existed nowhere else. If she failed, if she died, if she forgot, the system would have to be rebuilt from scratch. That weight settled on her shoulders and did not lift. Pederlunder returned in late September. He came with a wagon load of new barrels, the staves tight and the hoops true, better work than Eli had seen from any cooper in the district. He unloaded them near the surface shed and stood with his hat in his hands, waiting. "These are for the grain," he said. "The old ones are splitting. I saw the damage when I helped Toliff last winter." "You noticed that." "I notice barrels. It is what I do." He shrugged. "I also notice other things." Eli looked at him. He was not a handsome man, but he had good hands and steady eyes, and a way of standing that suggested he had nothing to prove and no desire to prove it. "What other things?" "You work alone. You teach everyone else how to build their own vaults, but no one helps you build yours. You carry water and split wood and lower buckets and raise them again, and you do it all by yourself because you do not know how to ask for help. I ask for help. You ask for information. You ask for materials. You do not ask for a partner." Eli felt something stir in her chest, something that was not anger or grief or the familiar weight of responsibility. "I do not need a partner." "Need is not the only reason to want one." Pater put his hat back on. "I have a proposal. Nothing romantic, nothing complicated. I work barrels, you work vaults. Together, we could do more than either of us can do alone." "And what would you want in return?" "Nothing you are not already giving. Knowledge, skills, a place where the work I do matters." He paused. "And maybe someday something else. But that would be your choice, not mine." Eli looked at him for a long time. She thought about Toliff's letter, about knowledge passing hand to hand, about building for the future instead of just surviving the present. "The grain barrels first," she said. "Then we will see?" Pater smiled, just slightly. "The grain barrels first." October came, and with it the first frost, and with the frost the familiar tightening that meant winter was approaching. But this winter was different. 8 vaults were ready on the hillsides around Pine Coulee. 3 more would be finished within weeks. The boarding house had a proper underground chamber now, 16 feet deep with double vents. Even Milo Haskins had a small vault behind his store, built with lumber he sold himself, and guidance he asked for without pride or resentment. The camp that had nearly starved the winter before was ready to thrive through the winter ahead. Eli stood at her head frame on the last day of October and looked out over the coulee. The smoke from chimneys rose straight in the still air. The sound of children playing drifted up from below. The head frames of a dozen vaults dotted the hillsides like sentinels, each one a copy of her father's work, each one a family preparing for what was coming. Niels came out of the shack and stood beside her. "Mama, is it going to be a hard winter again?" Eli looked at her son. He was 7 now, tall for his age, saw her with her father's eyes and her husband's stubborn chin. "Every winter is hard," she said. "That is why we prepare. But we are ready this time. We are ready." Niels looked out at the camp below, at the vaults, at the future that was taking shape in the ground. Grandfather knew, did he not? When he was digging all those years, he knew we would need it. Eli thought about her father, the silence that had surrounded him, the way he had never explained, never justified, never sought approval for the work he was doing. "I think he hoped," she said, "and hope is sometimes enough." They stood together at the head frame as the sun began to set behind the ridgeline, casting long shadows across the coulee. Below them, the camp was settling into evening. Above them, the first stars were appearing in the darkening sky. Winter was coming, but they were ready. The winter of 1881 to 82 was cold, but not cruel. The temperature dropped into the single digits in December and stayed there through January, but the killing cold of the previous year did not return. The road closed twice, once for a week in early January and once for 10 days in February, but neither closure lasted long enough to create real desperation. The difference was not the weather. The difference was preparation. Eli tracked the vault usage across the camp through a system of marks she kept on a slate board near her head frame. Each family reported what they withdrew and when, not because she demanded it, but because the information helped everyone understand how much remained and how to pace the consumption. By mid-February, the numbers told a story. While the original Vongen vault had fed 12 people through the worst 2 weeks of closure, Bridget's boarding house vault had served another 18. The 8 completed family vaults had provided for 31 more, with reserves to spare. Milo's store had not raised prices once. The credit ledgers had not grown. No one had died of hunger or exposure. Pine Coulee had survived its second hard winter, and this time it had not merely survived. It had endured with margin. The spring of 1882 brought visitors. Word of what had happened in Pine Coulee had spread through the mining districts over the winter. Freighters carried stories along with cargo. Miners moving between camps brought tales of the widow who fed a town from a dry well. By March, people were coming up Raven Grade not for gold or timber, but for knowledge. The first delegation arrived on a Tuesday in early April. 3 men from a camp called Rochford, 15 miles north, rode up the grade and asked to see the vault. Their camp had lost 4 people to starvation the previous winter. They wanted to build something better. Eli took them down the shaft one at a time. She showed them the main chamber, the dryer annex, the vent system, the surface shed. She explained the principles: temperature stability, moisture balance, air circulation, crop separation. She answered their questions until the questions stopped. "How much do you charge for this?" the oldest man asked. "Nothing." "Nothing?" "The knowledge is free. The labor is yours." The men looked at each other. They had expected a price, a negotiation, some form of transaction that would make the exchange comprehensible. Why? The oldest man asked. Eli thought about her father, who had built in silence. She thought about Toliff, who had taught without asking for payment. She thought about the winter just past, and the winter before that, and all the winters yet to come. "Because hunger does not negotiate," she said, "and preparation should not either." The men from Rochford stayed 3 days. They watched Eli work. They took notes. They asked more questions than she had answers for, which forced her to think harder about what she knew and why she knew it. When they left, they carried drawings, measurements, and a list of principles that would become the foundation for 5 new vaults in their camp before the next frost. Other delegations followed. By summer, Eli had hosted visitors from 7 different camps across the Black Hills. Some came with genuine interest. Some came with skepticism that dissolved when they saw the food coming up from the ground. A few came with commercial intentions, hoping to find some secret they could patent or sell, and left frustrated when they discovered the only secret was work. The Saturday dig days expanded. Families from neighboring camps began attending, learning techniques, borrowing tools, comparing results. The head frame above Eli's shaft became a landmark, the place you went if you wanted to understand how to keep food alive through winter. Petter Lunde was there through all of it. He had moved his barrel-making operation to a shed he built near the surface sorting house. His work and Eli's work had merged into something neither of them named, but both of them relied on. He made barrels. She filled them. He repaired what broke. She taught what she knew. The labor was shared, and the sharing made both of them stronger. Their partnership was not romantic, not yet. It was practical, grounded in the daily reality of work that needed doing and hands that needed help. But Eli noticed things she had not noticed before. The way Pater moved around Niels with easy patience. The way he listened when she explained something, really listened, not waiting for her to finish, but absorbing what she said. The way he was present without demanding attention, useful without expecting gratitude. She had not planned to trust anyone again after burying her husband and her father in the same year, but trust had crept up on her through shared work and quiet competence, and by the time she recognized it, it was already there. The hostile skeptic's final conversion came in the autumn of 1882. Milo Haskins had kept his word. He sold lumber and hardware at cost to anyone building a vault. He extended no credit for the purchases, took no interest, created no debt traps. His store survived on thinner margins, but it survived, and the camp's attitude toward him had shifted from contempt to something closer to wary acceptance. But acceptance was not redemption, and Milo knew it. He came to the acre on a morning in late September, when the first hints of frost were in the air and the harvest was being sorted for storage. Eli was in the surface shed separating potatoes by size and condition when she saw him climbing the grade. She waited for him to reach the head frame. "I built a vault last year," Milo said without preamble, "behind the store, and small, just for my household. I know, Bridget told me. It failed." Eli stopped sorting. She looked at him. "Failed how?" "The potatoes rotted, the onions went soft, the grain molded before Christmas." Milo's voice was flat, the voice of a man reciting facts he did not want to admit. "I followed the principles. I dug deep enough. I built the vents. But something was wrong and I could not figure out what." "Did you ask for help?" "No." "Why not?" Milo was silent for a long moment. His hands hung at his sides, empty and useless. "Because I was ashamed," he said finally. "I had spent 2 years mocking you, fighting you, trying to take what you had built. And then I tried to build my own, and I failed. How could I come to you after that?" Eli set down the potato she was holding. "Show me." They walked down to the store together, through the camp that had changed so much in 2 years that it barely resembled the place Eli had buried her father. The head frames dotted the hillsides. The vent boxes rose above the roof lines. The smell of fresh-cut timber mixed with the smell of autumn leaves. Milo's vault was behind the store, accessible through a trap door in the storage room. The shaft was 12 feet deep, the chamber perhaps 8 by 10, smaller than Eli's original, but adequate for a household of 3. She descended the ladder and stood in the chamber for a long time, not touching anything, just looking. The problem was obvious within a minute. "Your drainage is wrong," she said. "The floor slopes toward the wall instead of away from it. As moisture collects in the corner and spreads from there." She pointed to the corner where the mold had started. "And your vents are too close together. They create a dead zone in the center where air does not circulate. That is where the heat builds and the potatoes rot." Milo stood at the bottom of the ladder, watching her. "Can it be fixed?" "The drainage, yes. You need to dig out the floor and regrade it. The vents, no. You would have to start over with new shafts." She looked at him. "But you can compensate. If you rotate stock more frequently, if you check for moisture daily, if you never let the circulation stagnate, you can make this work." "You will teach me?" "Yes." "Why?" Eli climbed back up the ladder and stood in the storage room, looking at the man who had tried to buy her acre, who had mocked her father's work, who had raised prices while the camp starved. "Because you asked," she said, "and because the only way to stop being the man you were is to become someone else. You cannot do that alone." Milo's face changed. Something broke behind his eyes, some wall he had been maintaining since his niece died, since the winter proved him wrong, since he realized that everything he had built was smaller than what she was giving away. "I do not deserve your help," he said. "Probably not, but you are getting it anyway." She spent 3 hours in his vault that day, showing him how to read moisture, how to feel for dead air, how to adjust rotation schedules based on what the food was telling him. By the time she left, Milo understood more about preservation than he had learned in a year of failure. He never became a friend. No, some distances cannot be crossed entirely, but he became an ally, a man who had seen his own worst impulses fail and had chosen to be something better. When new families came to Pine Coulee seeking guidance, Milo directed them to the Vangen head frame. When visitors asked about the camp's survival system, he told the story without softening his own role in resisting it. That was worth more than friendship. That was conversion in the only form that mattered, visible and irreversible. The partnership with Peter Lunde became something more in the spring of 1883. There was no single moment of transformation, no dramatic declaration, no romantic gesture, no scene that would have satisfied a novelist. Instead, there was accumulation. Days of working side by side became weeks. Weeks became seasons. And somewhere in the passage of time, the practical arrangement they had made became something neither of them had planned. He proposed in April, standing at the head frame where Eli had stood so many times, looking out over the coulee that had become the center of their shared work. "I am not offering to save you," Peter said. "You do not need saving. I am offering to work beside you for the rest of our lives, if that is something you want." Eli looked at him, the man who had brought wood when she was freezing, the man who had made barrels when the grain was splitting, the man who had been present through grief and crisis and the slow rebuilding that followed. "It is something I want," she said. They married in June. The ceremony was small. He held at the boarding house because it was the only building in Pine Coulee large enough to hold the guests. Bridget cooked the meal from stores that came from her own vault. Harlon Pike stood witness. Niels, now 8 years old, carried the ring on a cushion his mother had sewn from scraps. The marriage changed nothing about the work and everything about the life around it. Peter moved into the shack, which they rebuilt over the summer, into something larger and more permanent. A proper kitchen, a separate room for Niels, a porch facing the head frame where they could sit in the evenings and watch the camp settle into twilight. Children came, a daughter in 84 named Ragna after Eli's mother, a son in 86 named Aslak after the grandfather who had never met him. The shack expanded again to hold them. The barrel operation grew to supply not just Pine Coulee, but the camps beyond, and the vault system that had started as one man's secret became the foundation for a life that neither Eli nor Peter could have built alone. The years that followed compressed into rhythms. Winter survived and summers celebrated. Harvest stored and stores consumed. Children growing taller, then growing independent, then bringing children of their own to stand at the head frame and learn what generations before them had learned. Eli taught until she could no longer climb the ladder. Then she taught from the surface, describing what she could not demonstrate, answering questions from memory that had become instinct over decades. The camp changed around her. The gold played out. The miners left. Families stayed because the land could feed them now, because the vaults had transformed subsistence into stability. Pine Coulee became less a mining camp and more a farming community, and the head frames that dotted the hillsides became as ordinary as barns, as essential as wells, as unremarkable as the air everyone breathed. Harlon Pike died in 1891, old and tired and satisfied with the life he had lived. Bridget Coyle died in 93, her boarding house vault still operating, still feeding travelers who passed through on their way to somewhere else. Milo Haskins died in 98, his store long closed, but his reputation long redeemed, a man who had changed when change was hardest. Petter went in 1904, quietly in his sleep, the way Toliff had gone 2 decades before. Eli buried him beside her father and her first husband. Watching the cemetery overlooking the coulee, and she stood at the grave until the sun went down. She lived another 19 years after that. The children tended her, then the grandchildren. She moved slowly by the end, her hands stiff, her eyes dim. But every autumn, until the last autumn, she made her way to the head frame and felt the air in the shaft, and checked the vent positions, and tasted the first potato lifted from the chamber below. Some things you do not delegate. Some things you carry until you cannot carry them anymore. Within 5 years of Eli's first winter, 8 households in Bridget Coyle's boarding house had vault systems built from her measurements or under her supervision. By the end of the decade, the number had grown to 19, scattered across the coulee and into the camps beyond. See, children who grew up watching their parents dig began calling the paired vent boxes Vangen breaths, and the name stuck long after the children forgot where it had come from. The dry well that everyone had mocked became the model that everyone copied, and the knowledge that Aslak Vangen had buried in the ground rose up into the light where it could be shared, taught, and passed from hand to hand until it belonged to no one and everyone. Eli lived out her life on the same rocky acre where her father had dug his impossible hole. The shack became a house, the house became a homestead, and the homestead became the place people remembered when they thought of how the camp had survived. She kept Aslak's oak door at the bottom of the shaft instead of replacing it, because by then the chamber was no longer only storage. It was family history. Through an argument won, winter memory made physical in timber and stone. She died in 1923, 91 years old, in the bedroom that looked out over the head frame, and they buried her beside Pater and her father and her first husband, all of them together in the ground that had kept so many alive. Return now to that January morning in 1881 to 17 degrees below zero, and the road buried under 8 feet of drift, to the camp huddled in cold, and the stores running thin, and the panic spreading like frost across glass. Harlon Pike had stood at that head frame months before and delivered his verdict. That hole will not feed your boy. By January, he will starve in your arms. He was wrong. On the worst nights, what came up from the dry well was not grief, but ration buckets, potatoes furred with cellar dust, the onions dry as paper, bean sacks thudding onto frozen boards, Eli Vangen lowering herself into the shaft by lantern light, rope burning grooves into her palms, while hungry families waited at the collar for what she would bring. By thaw, the camp no longer laughed at the well, because it had spent a winter eating from it, and when the road opened again in spring, the rope over Aslak Vangen's head frame was worn smooth by the hands it had kept alive.